Hey folks, I want to do something a little different today, and instead of walking through the traditional, how to make a line, how to make a plane, whatever, real specific content, I thought I might try a little bit of a different format here and walk you through making some basic changes to an existing project that I've got here. So this is a model I've already worked up. It's a two-part clamshell mount for a GoPro on a Kubota ROPS, on a Kubota tractor. And the features I want to add are, I want to add a couple of through holes essentially in this back part so that I can thread some through bolts, or rather thread some threaded inserts in and then put through bolts to secure, various other bits and pieces to this. So how are we going to do that? We already have a couple of things that help us out here. So I've already got a mid-plane created. So I think one of the first things I'm going to do is create a sketch on this mid-plane. So I'm going to select that mid-plane and hit Create Sketch. Now I want to be able to center this all in some way that centers the holes, but also doesn't interfere with any of the other existing geometry I've got. So I've got some geometry up here, and not that I'm going to necessarily push the holes through this part. I think I'd like the option to do so. So in terms of geometry, I want to make sure I stay out of the way of. I want to make sure I stay sort of in the bounds of this rectangle here, this flat. And I also want to make sure I stay away from the mount feature up front here. So to do that, we're going to use the Project tool, and I use Shift-P for that, but you can also get that from the Create and Project menu. And now I still am in sketch mode, so I'm going to select a couple of things. First, I'm going to select this back plane, and I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. We'll project that first. And just to hide our bodies, you can see what we've got now is a purple box, and the purple indicates that we used a projection link, which is what we want to use. And that box represents essentially the projection of this this feature, this back rectangle here, through onto our sketch. We're going to go ahead and do another project here, and this time I'm going to grab up front. I'm going to grab a couple features off this. I'm going to grab that line and that line. And again, keep projection link checked off and hit OK here. We'll see that we have these two lines in here. We're not really going to use these lines for anything specific other than for some reference. All right. So let's go ahead now and create a couple of new lines, and these are just going to be some construction, some alignment lines. So I'm going to get out my line tool, which I get to by hitting L. And I'm going to come over here, and you can see this was added, I think, this year in Fusion, some snap alignments. So you can see as I approach the midpoint of this vertical line, that little triangle shows up right there. And that tells us that it's going to create a midpoint constraint when we start this. So that's fine. I'm going to click and release. I'm going to come over and we can see that triangle pop up. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to hit Escape to get back to my select tool. Now I'm going to click that line and hit X, and that converts it to a construction line. That just means that that line will no longer show up once we're out of sketch mode. So you won't be able to, say, extrude based off of it, which is just fine. So now we're going to make two more lines. We're going to do the same thing. Because we see this little X here, it snaps to, tells us we're going to have a coincidence on this, which is just fine. And we'll do another one over here. There's a little bit of lag in Fusion for some reason here. Haven't quite riddled that out yet, but it doesn't seem to affect functionality. I'm going to hit Escape to get back to Select. I'm going to select each of my vertical lines and hit X to create construction lines. Now we can see in terms of constraints, these lines cannot move up and down, but they can move side to side. They are constrained horizontally, which is exactly what we want. Now we want to make sure that we essentially center these between the bounds of our model. And there's a couple ways to do that. We could take some measurements and we could define things, or we could use some dimensions. So I'm going to hit D to bring up the dimension tool, and I'm going to click on the first projected line, and then I'm going to click on the middle line. And I'm going to pull this up here. And when I try to create it, it's going to squawk at me. And this is basically telling us that this would over-constrain the sketch. And it would do so because these purple lines are projected lines from the existing geometry. In other words, they already have a definition, and I cannot use the dimension tool to give them a dimension. However, I can create a driven dimension, which is sort of a red dimension. In other words, it's going to read the existing dimension off of there just as a reference point, which is fine. That's really all I want. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, get the same prompt. But now that we have that dimension to reference, we can make additional dimensions based on that driven dimension. So in order to center each of these lines, we can very simply measure from one of the outside bounds to our line. And now we're going to go ahead and click on the larger dimension and divide that by 2. And what that'll do, obviously, it'll give us a dimension that's exactly half of the distance between these 2 points, which essentially gives us a center. Now, there are a million other ways to center geometry within Fusion, but this is a relatively quick way to get it done. All right. So now we've got that. We now need to create 2 different hole sizes. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my parameters. And I've added a few in here already. So UT underscore is my sort of utility through hole. And these 3 dimensions are the ones that matter for me. Now, I'm going to be using a threaded insert and a 1/4 20 bolt. So my threaded inserts look like this. These are pretty standard inserts. You get them from McMaster or Lowe's or whatnot. They're intended to drive into wood, but they work pretty well on 3D printed parts because they have such a big bite. Now, there's a few features about these that are a little strange. One is they are tapered. So in order to account for that taper, we could certainly create a conical recess, but instead what I'm going to do is I've taken a dimension approximately half, a little higher up than halfway up, as the diameter, so that the first portion will go in without much resistance, but then we'll tighten up toward the end, and that's just fine. I've also taken a total height measurement off of these. So coming back to Fusion here, what those have come out to, so our insert depth is that total height, that was 12.5 mil, and our insert diameter was 8.1. Again, that was part way up the insert. And then the bolt, the 1/4 20 bolt that I'm going to be using is just about 6 millimeters, so I'm going to go with 6.1 to give it a little breathing room. Now, because we've done these as parameters, we've talked about parameters before, but with these done as parameters, it's nice because when we define our sketches and models based on these parameters, if it turns out that we print it out and it ends up being wrong, all I have to do is come back and adjust these parameters, and it will adjust the model accordingly. So we're going to go ahead and create 2 sets of circles at each of these intersections. So I'm going to hit C for my circle tool, but you could also grab it from the sketch bar up here. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And I'm just going to hover over this, and I'll get my little midpoint thing, which will tell us that we're going to intersect and we're going to be midpoint and coincident with these lines. I'm going to click. And now in here, I'm going to type UT, and I'll bring up my little quick select menu. And first, I'm going to do my bolt diameter. Hit enter twice. So now we can see it says FX. That tells us that essentially we are defining this based on something, a function, whether that's a parameter or some other dimension. I'm going to hit C again. I'm going to hit that center point again. I'm going to draw it out. Type in UT, and this time I'm going to put in the, the insert, the bolt, did I use the bolt diameter? Oops, let's do the insert diameter, excuse me. There we go. So we have our 2 different dimensions there now. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing over here. Okay. So now, from a geometry standpoint, we've got everything we need here. We have our 2 circles, our 2 diameters, right? One for the through hole and one for our recess. We have those well defined. We have them where we want in our sketch. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Finish Sketch now. I have to show my sketches again. So now we're going to go ahead and start doing some projects. I'm going to hide side B because we're not going to work on that one for now. So we're going to do some, or rather not some projects, we're going to do some extrudes. So now we want to do a couple of different extrudes, and I wanted to make this mid-plane based because it gives a good chance to talk about doing extrusions with various offsets. So I'm going to hit E to bring up the extrusion tool, and we will start with our through holes because those are sort of the easiest. I'm not holding shift or anything, I'm just selecting my 2 through holes. Now there's a couple ways we could do this. We could just drag this all the way through to some arbitrary number and cut the whole way through. And that would technically work just fine, but it's a little bit of a messy way to do it, and we can be more specific how we do this. So we can do that by going over here to our start, and this is essentially the point from which we are going to start our extrude. And I'm going to say from object. And in this case, I can actually choose the plane that I want to start cutting from. So I'm going to start cutting from this plane. And now very simply, we're going to say offset of 0, direction one-sided. And our extent, in other words, how far are we going to make this cut? We're going to do another to object, and I'm going to select the other side. And now we've got our holes that are being cut confined specifically through these faces. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, or actually make sure that operation is set to cut. And then we're going to go ahead and hit OK. Now we want to make our counter bores. Now our counter bores are not going to go the whole way through the piece. And in order to do that, we're going to do a very similar thing to before. We're going to bring up E for our extrude menu again. I'm going to grab these counter bores. Right, these are for the insert diameters. We're going to do similar to before. Our start is going to be from object, and our start is going to be this plane again. Now the difference is our extent is going to be a specific distance because we don't want to go all the way through. We're going to use our parameter, and we're going to go our insert depth. And now what we'll see is that's going to cut our insert not the entire way through this part, but the majority of the way through it. Okay? We're going to go ahead and make sure this is on cut and hit OK. And now if I hide our sketch, what we should see is we have some counterbore holes that will allow our threaded inserts to come in through the back, and then when we thread our bolts in through this dimension, they will pull against this shoulder. Last couple things to do here is add some quick additional features. I'm going to add a chamfer to both of these edges here. And it's going to be a very small chamfer, 0.5 millimeter, just enough to sort of guide any bolt that I'm trying to thread in there. And then on the other side here, I'm going to add a slightly larger chamfer. And the reason for that is these have a pretty large flange on them. If you can see the flange here, that comes out a pretty good distance. And that flange is also asymmetric. It doesn't have a 45-degree angle. So we're going to make a asymmetric chamfer. So we're going to select our chamfer tool and select both our surfaces. Now we're going to say chamfer type. We're going to change this to 2 distances. And Fusion is having a little bit of a hard time here. Let's try that again. There we go. Change this to 2 distances. And just for giggles here, we'll change this to 1 and change this to 2. Now that gives us the opposite of what we want. We want one that is essentially wider than it is deep. So I think a 1 millimeter deep, 2 millimeter wide asymmetric chamfer looks pretty good on those. We'll go ahead and hit OK. And we're done. So that gives us now our counterbore holes that we can push our threaded inserts through on this side and be able to pull our bolts through on this side. I hope you all enjoyed that. I know this is a little bit of a different format than usual. If you like this sort of format and want to see more of it, let me know. Or if you want to go back to the more specific content, let me know that also. Thanks so much.